If anybody else watched the Japanese Grand Prix and you weren't exactly sure what was going on, don't worry, you're not alone. Until I went through the entire race and analyzed the data hours later, I was pretty much as confused as you were. My initial reaction to that race was nothing actually happened, but the data actually shows us some pretty interesting stories. Here's what we're going to look at during this video. After the initial red flag period for the Sainz crash, we were reminded yet again how useless are the Pirelli wet weather tires. But why is that? We're also going to dig into some of the wet weather strategy basics and see what we can learn from what happened throughout the grid. There were some big brains plays and there were some pretty massive screw ups. It also looks like Mercedes have found a few tricks up their sleeve that I don't think anybody else is paying too much attention to them yet. And then finally, the Ferrari of Leclerc had some massive issues in the race, but this really confuses me because I feel like the problems in the wet versus their problems in the dry are completely different. But before we get into the data, we've got to talk about two things first. Why on earth are there recovery vehicles and tractors on the circuit in low visibility conditions? I mean, I was an engineer at Force India in 2014 and seeing this stuff happen during the race actually makes me sick to my stomach. I really hope the FIA take this to heart and understand exactly what happened here instead of trying to brush it under the carpet like it seemed like they were trying to do during the race. But let's move on to the next FIA disaster before we get into the data of the Grand Prix. And trust me, the data part is the best part. I know there's all sorts of things going on in the media right now regarding Red Bull's procedural and minor breaches of the cost cap regulations. And if these cost cap rules aren't clear on what's happening as a result of those findings, the rules were equally unclear about how many points were going to be rewarded as the result of a shortened Japanese Grand Prix. But for just a minute, can you imagine how it must have felt for your best friend Johnny Herbert to tell you that you're the world champion? But anyway, so if you're not familiar with the rules, don't worry. No one else actually knew what was happening before this weekend either, so we'll explain it now. As a result of the weather-suspended Belgian Grand Prix in 2021, the rules were updated to reward points based on the distance completed in the instance of a suspended race. But the 2022 Japanese Grand Prix was red flagged and delayed substantially due to rain. The delay was so much that we only got to complete 28 racing laps. And after the rules adjustment last year, people were expecting the race points to only be rewarded as if we had completed 3/4 of a race. However, since the race was resumed after being suspended and then completed the total 3-hour time limit, full points were actually rewarded. Now, this is great, but this also means that a race could be started, suspended, delayed long enough so that you only complete a few laps and then you could still be rewarded full points for this. I think everybody agrees that these rules actually need some work. Okay, now it's time to get into the data of the Japanese Grand Prix. So the race begins with a standing start on the intermediate tires. Halfway through the lap, Sainz has a massive shunt and causes a red flag. But in that very short lap, we actually had a lot of action worth looking at. I mean, how awesome was it seeing Max too wide with Leclerc holding on to the lead into turn 2 after Leclerc had a brilliant race start. We were also a little bit distracted by Vettel, unable to see through the spray, turning into Alonso at just before turn 1, which sends Vettel all the way to the back of the field. But don't worry, we've got a lot more to talk about on Seb's race. Now, one thing that took me a little while to register was Lance Stroll had probably one of the most mental starts that I've seen in a while, sending it up the inside and threading the needle to go from P19 all the way up to P11. Not bad at all. Now, in order to make the race start a little bit more clear, I've made a graphic here which demonstrates how many positions drivers have gained or lost on the opening lap. We can see up here Stroll from 19th up to 11. Magnussen also had a great start from 18th up to 12th. Latifi and Mick also gaining 5 positions. Tsunoda gaining 4 positions. And then we've got quite a few people gaining 1 position as a result of Sainz crashing. Ricciardo has a decent start. Vettel obviously to the back. Norris and Zhou have pretty rough starts. Bottas as well, and Gasly loses 1 spot. So that is a great way to visualize how many positions people have lost or gained over a single lap. And we'll come back to this figure in a minute. Now, after Sainz crashes, the race was red flagged and the weather gets even worse. At this point, we're reminded that the Pirelli wet weather tires are completely useless. Or are they? Let's talk about it. Now, in general, the wettest part of the circuit dictates which tire you need to run. Clearly, the rivers running across the circuit were too severe for the intermediate tires at the race start, hence Sainz crashing, but the track was ready for inters everywhere else. So the track was too dry for full wets and too wet for inters. Okay, we've got a little problem there. Fast forward to the race restart. The drivers complete a few laps behind the safety car on full wet tires. Then, a lap later, drivers are already pitting for intermediates. So what's the actual point of these full wet tires? If the drivers could have pit immediately for inters, surely the track was ready ages ago for full wets. Why did they delay so long before the race start? And I've got 2 theories regarding this. During extended red flag periods where heavy rain is an issue, the medical or safety car will will be out on the track, doing laps and feeding back the information to the race control and the track conditions, taking into account the overall level of water, any large puddles or rivers across the circuit, and any other conditions that's important for restarting the race. The safety car will have concluded that the rivers and standing water on the circuit were too severe for full wet tires and recommended that the race control delay the start further. So maybe during the periods of heavy rainfall, rivers flowing across the circuit would have been an aquaplaning risk even for the full wet tires. But as soon as the rainfall reduces, the rivers also reduce. In that case, this could be a circuit-specific issue, but I'm not sure it's that. Now, the second idea is that maybe the race director deliberately avoided full wet conditions. One of the main issues with the full wet tires, and it's even present on the intermediates, is the amount of spray in the air and reducing the visibility. Now, perhaps they were consciously avoiding running in severe conditions in order to minimize potential accidents and further safety cars. So there's really only two things. Either the full wet tires aren't fit for purpose, or for some reason the FIA keeps wanting to avoid using them. But since we're talking about wet weather performance, let's go back to the data and have a look at who won and who lost out on the race restart. Now, let's remember the race restarted on full wet tires behind the safety car. And the main question that everybody had immediately was, is the track ready for inters yet? And this became clear very quickly. Now, check this out. These are the positions gained and lost through the pit stop sequence. We're looking at between laps 5 and 13 to see, this entire pit stop sequence, because some people pit early and some people pit later. You can see that Vettel goes from 18th to 6th, so completely recovering that poor race start in the collision with Alonso. Latifi goes all the way from 17 to P8, and Norris has a really good jump up from 13th to 9th. But as we look through this, we see that a lot of people actually lost out pretty big here. In short, everybody that pit early gained massively, and the longer people waited, the more they lost out. So the big losers from this pit stop sequence were Russell, we'll have a look at that in a minute, Ricciardo also waited a bit, and Mick Schumacher lost out the most, going from 10th to 18th. So let's have a look at this and see what actually happened for Mick, because that's bad. So let's use this race positions chart to help demonstrate what happened. We saw Mick Schumacher go from P10 here until after everybody's pit stop, and he's all the way at the back of the field in P18. What was Haas thinking with this? Did they throw away a solid points finish? Almost certainly, but let's have a look at this with a bit of hindsight and try to figure it out. I mean, here's the situation. We saw Vettel and Latifi pit early, and they ended up looking like heroes. But was there another viable gamble in this whole situation? We hear on the radio at one point Mick's engineer telling him they are hoping for a safety car. At this point, everybody else had pit, and they were up to P2, and they were even P1 on track briefly. I mean, this is a big risk, big reward scenario. If they had had a safety car at this point when they were running first or second on the track, they could have really bagged themselves an easy 4th or 5th place finish. But does this risk actually make any sense? Like, I always thought for wet weather racing, it's right tires, right time. Those are the golden rules. So here's a different way to look at this. Let's actually look at the lap times. Imagine most of the pack is doing a 108-second lap, and Mick is doing about 114-second laps. So, I mean, he's losing so much time. But at that point, they had made their bed. They had to stick it out and hope for the safety car. And if they end up on the back, they end up on the back. Now, let's flip this whole thing around. Clearly, they missed this trick on the early pit stop. But if you're racing for 1 or 2 points on most race weekends, what if you had the chance to finish P5 if you made a huge risk? You finish P5, or you don't get any points at all. I think that makes sense. That actually could make a huge impact on the Drivers' Championship for Mick and Haas in the Constructors' Championship. So my reaction was initially very critical of Haas when I was watching the race, but it actually makes a bit of sense strategically for them. It just didn't work out. Now, there was actually some pretty interesting stuff throughout the rest of the field, such as Mercedes' pace and their strategy, and both of the Alpines had some interesting stuff going on. So before we shift focus over to the Red Bulls and Leclerc, let's dig into that. The Mercedes didn't look like much, but there's actually a few pretty cool things that happened during their race, and I'm not sure very many people saw them. So let's rewind all the way back to Singapore last weekend. At the race start on intermediate tires, Lewis told his team they messed up. They put on the wrong tires. Initially, I thought, why would you want to start on the wet tires instead of the inters? Actually, he wanted to start on a set of lightly used intermediates and not new intermediates. What's that about? So it's no secret that the Mercedes does struggle a little bit with warm-up, but Mercedes feel like they might have found an edge here when using the wet weather tires. Now, a week ago, their engineers didn't think so, but the drivers pushed for it, and they tried it this weekend in Japan. Now, if we have a look at the tire usage charts and focus on Hamilton and Russell, we can see that Hamilton started the race on scrubbed full wets and then pit for scrubbed inters. Russell starts the race on new wets, but he also fits scrubbed inters when they stop. As far as I could tell, these tires were only a couple of laps old, so it's unlikely they had much tread wear on them, but they do seem to think that this helps their warm-up on the inters. So let's see if anyone else adopts this theory. Maybe in Austin or probably in Brazil we could have some wet weather. So now, if we look at what actually happened during the race, you can see the race gaps here. After the pit stop sequence, Hamilton spends the entire race stuck up the gearbox of Ocon. He tried every move in the book to get past him, but why did he struggle so much to overtake Ocon? Well, there's a couple reasons, and let's look into it. Now, we're going to jump around a little bit here, and we're going to look back to qualifying. This is the lap time versus top speed chart. So this shows us left to right how fast they were in a straight line. You can see the Astons, the slowest in a straight line, and you can see Albon and the Red Bulls fastest in a straight line. Then, if you look at this chart, whoever's closer to the bottom was the fastest lap time. This chart is a good way to give us an understanding of teams' compromises between their car pace and then also how much drag and downforce they're running. So obviously the Ferraris and Red Bull in a different league altogether. But what's interesting is we notice that here's the Astons, the slowest team in a straight line. The Mercedes were the second slowest team in a straight line. And if we're talking about Ocon, we notice that the Alpines are only 5 kilometers an hour faster. In dry conditions and qualifying, 5 kilometers an hour really doesn't mean much. But then take that and go to a wet race without DRS, you could have a serious disadvantage on your hands. So let's try and talk about that. Mercedes ended up running quite a bit more downforce here in order to be competitive. Another consideration is maybe they hedged their bets a bit by qualifying with a bit more downforce than optimal so that they had more performance in the race that was expected to be wet. Now this makes sense. If you know that it's going to be wet, maybe give up a few spots in qualifying for a much better wet weather performance. But what happened? The first thing to think about is in terms of outright pace, the Merc and the Alpine were actually pretty similar. But if we take a step back and look at the telemetry from them during the race, I think it becomes a little bit more clear. So here's an example of lap 21 Hamilton versus Ocon. Hamilton in blue, Ocon in red. Now I'm just going to gloss through this pretty quickly and try to explain what I'm seeing here. You can see into turn 1, Lewis has a lot more top speed, but he has to brake so much earlier and he doesn't really get a chance to overtake Ocon into turn 1 too. Another thing that you see Lewis doing is slowing down the entrances to these corners and focusing on getting a better exit. And the Mercedes coupled with a more attacking on the exit line, Lewis does have more pace coming out of the corners, but he's still not able to get close enough to Ocon. So you can also see, look how the Mercedes car speed doesn't drop here and here. That's because the Mercedes is actually deploying more energy in a strategic way in order to help them to overtake into these places. So Mercedes set up their strategies so that they would have more energy to deploy into turn 1 and into the final chicane here. Here's the 130R and here's the final chicane. Lewis was giving it everything that he had. I mean, we did see that he got close a couple times here going into the spoon curves or turn 13 and 14, but on this instance, he was focusing on going slow into 13 and getting a good drive out of 14 in order to try and attack into the chicane in turn 16. On this instance, Lewis does get a run here, but he has to check up so much going through 130R that he's way off in terms of braking for the final corner. Hamilton's race was pretty boring, but what happened to George Russell? Now, we saw him doing some pretty impressive overtakes, but how the hell did he end up so far back? So if we go back to the graphic highlighting what happened between lap 5 and 13 in the pit stop sequence, we can see that Russell lost out here the most. He went from 7th all the way back to 11th. Just checking sector times on in and out laps, he lost about 5 seconds to Hamilton in the pit stop sequence. Part of this was because they stacked the cars on the same lap. This is honestly the least worst option in my opinion. Now, just checking sector times on in and out laps, he lost about 5 seconds to Hamilton from the pit stop sequence. Part of this is because they did stack cars on the pit stops in the same lap. Now, going back to our race positions chart, I think that was actually the least worst option. You can see here, Hamilton holds on to P5, then after the whole pit stop sequence is over, Russell ends up back in 11th spot, but he's lost out quite a few positions. And this just goes to show you how critical pit stopping at the perfect moment in the wet can be. Now, Russell seemed pretty upset about it, but this was going to happen unless they pulled the trigger and stopped very aggressively like Latifi or Vettel. So if they had stopped Russell a lap later to avoid the stack, they would have been even worse off in terms of lap time loss to everybody else already on the intermediate tires. So honestly, fair play to the Mercedes pit wall here. Now, with fair play to Russell here, we have Hamilton, Russell, and Verstappen's lap times at the end of the race. You can see here we've got Hamilton stuck in traffic, George here stuck in traffic. Now George is in clean air. At the end of the race, George Russell is actually similar lap times to Max Verstappen leading the race. Honestly, I think the Mercedes had some pace in it without the top speed advantage and the DRS. Hamilton was kind of stuck behind Ocon, but in clean air, the Mercedes was pretty quick, and I feel like they probably made the right call in terms of their downforce level. I imagine Hamilton would have been quite a bit quicker if he could have also cleared Ocon, but that's what we've got. So we've talked a bit about Ocon, but what about Alonso? Alonso spent most of his race here, you can see, stuck behind Vettel, and he got pretty bored of it at one point. So around lap 22, he decides to pit for new intermediate tires. The difference in pace between a used Inter and a new Inter is actually insane in this case. Now, before the stop, Vettel and Alonso were doing pretty much the same pace as Hamilton and Ocon defending, so I feel like maybe Alonso didn't really have that much more pace than just following Seb here. But when Alonso stops for new Inters and gets into free air, the pace on these things is absolutely insane. Alonso with the fresh Inters is actually about 4 seconds a lap faster than Vettel as he catches him by the end of the race to finish only 100th of a second behind Vettel. Unfortunately, the TV director completely missed this. Now, the TV director also missed a chance to see Alonso taking a cheeky detour through the final chicane on his lap when he pit for the new Inters, which saved him, from the data, it looks about like 2 seconds on his in lap, so that was pretty naughty. So it's pretty clear that the intermediate tires can go a very long distance, but you've got to look after them. This means driving the car carefully and not overloading them. And it also means you need a car setup which allows you to look after the tires, which brings me to my next point. It's pretty clear that during the race, nobody had an answer for Verstappen. But considering how close the Ferrari and the Red Bull were in the dry, why was the Ferrari of Leclerc struggling so much in these wet conditions? Now, I'm pretty sure the Ferrari is very good at warming up their tires, and maybe sometimes they warm them up a bit too much. But in the wet conditions, at least in Suzuka, they had a completely different problem, which I don't recall seeing yet this year. Now, this one's actually really confusing for a couple of reasons, so let's dig into it. From everything that I've seen this year, the Ferrari seems like a car that performs very well with a lot of front end, and this is kind of confirmed by a few things for me. The first point, Ferrari tend to struggle a bit more with overheating than others. This has been especially true since the summer break with events like Spa and Monza. Both of the drivers, even in the press, have confirmed this, that they struggle a little bit too much with overheating. Yes, the Ferrari has quite a bit of downforce, probably the most on the grid, which is great for generating stress and temperature in the tires. But the fact that the rears tend to overheat quite a bit tells me they rely on a relatively pointy car to be fast, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but it does have some downsides. Now here's the second point. Just looking at the telemetry from qualifying, in the high-speed corners, they definitely have a lot of downforce and grip, but they also spend a lot of time on the throttle in these corners just to stabilize the car. Here we've got Verstappen in blue and Leclerc in red. Just look, for example, at the high-speed corners through the S's in turn 3 and 6, the Ferrari keeping the car on the throttle. Part of that is because they have more grip and pace through here, but I think part of that's actually because they need the throttle to stabilize the car. They're close to flat in turn 8, that's fine, but going into the spoon curves, turn 13 and 14, look at the Ferrari. A lot more throttle being carried on the way into that, and that is usually to stabilize a nervous or oversteery car. This tells me actually two different things. The car does have a lot of front end, so they're using the throttle to stabilize the car. And the second part of that is, if you're on throttle stabilizing the car in high-speed corners, you are going to be putting more stress onto the rear tires. So why is this whole thing interesting? Well, at the end of the race, Leclerc's front tires were completely bald in the middle, whereas Verstappen still had quite a bit of tread left on these intermediates. So you're telling me a super pointy, high downforce Ferrari is destroying front tires when we're on intermediates, but overheating rears all day in the dry? Now, this did surprise me a little bit, and the only thing I can speculate is that the Ferrari is so pointy in dry conditions that they have to remove quite a bit of front wing in order to make the car stable or drivable in wet conditions. Now, looking back to the race, maybe early on in that intermediate stint, Leclerc was pushing too hard and overheated the fronts, which led to excessive wear. Honestly, the whole Ferrari balance thing is giving me more questions than answers, but it's something super interesting. Now, it is starting to look like at this point in the season, the Red Bull is just a faster and probably more rounded car overall, with a huge operating window, and it's happy in all sorts of conditions. The race finishes with Max winning by a margin of nearly 30 seconds. I mean, Perez is promoted to P2 after Leclerc has a lockup and goes wide off the track in the final chicane. And then, to pretty much everybody's surprise, Max was rewarded full race points, and he is crowned the 2022 Formula One World Champion. And anyway, next week, I'm going to be at Circuit of the Americas and hopefully working on some completely different content for you guys over the weekend. If you're out there and you see me, do be sure to say hello. I've left a couple of my recent videos here, so if you're looking at some more data, look no further, and I'll see you all soon.